Hey, welcome back to my channel, and welcome to October, which is otherwise known as Inktober. To any of you comic book artists, illustrators, anyone who's interested in this world of comics and illustration is probably aware of the inking challenge that happens on, I guess, mainly Instagram, called Inktober. The challenge is to draw a drawing with ink in some capacity and post it to your page every day for the month of October. Many artists work within a theme for this challenge. I'd say if there's any artist worth following, it would be Chris Somney. He does Battober. It's one of the best times of the year as far as comics and illustrations go. It's a treat every day to see the level of Batman drawing that he puts out on a daily basis. Personally, I'm doing something called Bugtober, which is Bughead. I've mentioned it on this channel before. It's, for one reason or another, something I've kind of become known for because of my work with Archie Comics and the Riverdale series. And so because I do a lot of Bughead drawings, I thought I would do Bugtober. So for the Inktober challenge, I'll be creating a Bughead drawing every day. I'm going to be drawing Bughead as. So I'll be inserting Bughead into classic movies and TV and other forms of pop culture. So hopefully it's interesting for the Bughead fans out there, and incorporating these other elements into it will definitely keep it interesting for me as well. But yeah, Inktober. I feel like Inktober is a good opportunity to talk about inking in general. Inking is taking your pencil drawing and turning it into a ink drawing. A lot of comic artists today ink their own pencils, and a lot of comic artists today digitally ink their own work. So the art of inking is no longer a messy one for a lot of us. But in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about what inking actually is, what an inker's contribution is to comic art in general, why there ever was such thing as an inker, and hopefully give you something to think about when you're inking your work, whether you're inking it traditionally or digitally. So I'm no comic historian in any way, but I think that inking started because back when comics were first made, specifically being printed in newspapers, it was a very primitive, very basic, early printing process back then. So in order for something to get printed clearly in a newspaper or in a magazine, the delineation between black and white needed to be very clear. Artists also realized that the printers weren't able to pick up a lot of the nuance and gradients that something like pencil or watercolor or ink wash would create. So because of this, we were left with a very strong black and white approach to creating comic art. Now, because the printing process and the paper that was being used wasn't able to pick up on gradients and washes, but the artist still wanted to create atmospheres and environments and effects that sort of mimicked that, all these inking techniques were utilized, such as hatching or stippling or feathering. All these techniques were there to indicate something going from black to white or white to black in a way that wasn't so stark and bold. So it gave it a little bit of a middle tone. Comic artists and illustrators of this very early era really mastered these techniques. And even as the printing process became much more advanced and coloring got more technical and fancy, these inking techniques were still utilized. In fact, a lot of them are still utilized today. So I think a lot of us making comics today aren't always aware of the origin of a lot of these techniques. Especially nowadays, with the click of a button, you can very easily achieve a gradient or some sort of cross-hatching effect. But in order to evolve, get better, and have a deeper understanding of the art of inking, whether you're going to be inking traditionally or digitally, I think like anything else, it's important to go back to history. I think that's why in a lot of my videos, I sort of go back to specific eras of comics when there was something there that perhaps isn't there today, or the great stuff that we have today is really in response to the stuff that was created back then. And when you go back through various eras of comic history, one of the things that comes up, and one of the things that I've mentioned before as a sort of intangible quality that contributes to the powerfulness of that work, is the collaboration aspect. Personally, I've never worked with an inker. I've always inked my own art, and I've never professionally inked anyone else's art. I'd have to imagine that there's a great level of trust that both artists have to have in each other. And the strength of a specific art team, a specific penciler and inker combo, was really contingent on that book's success. Throughout history of comics, I could think of certain penciler-inker duos that just worked really well. Jim Lee and Scott Williams is probably the one that has stood the longest test of time. And in many ways, their work just gets better and better. It's pretty incredible. But I think the thing that they both have is trust in the other. And of course, after decades of working with each other, that trust becomes nurtured and built up more and more. But in the beginning, when you're first handing your work over to someone to ink, I'm sure you're taking a real leap of faith. And in many ways, I feel like inkers, I have such great respect for inkers because they really have to prove themselves. And once they get to that level of having inked several artists' work, they actually become sought out. Pencilers then want to work with specific inkers because they know that they'll actually make their work even better. And I think one of the intangible qualities that an inker has, and perhaps has to have in order to be a great inker, is the ability to see the potential within a penciler. And so in making this video, I wanted to showcase various inkers and their different abilities. And I was trying to figure out a way to make a video that is interesting and entertaining without just being sort of like a list that I go through. And so I decided, instead of just going down a list of inkers, I would pick one particular penciler and show how different inkers interpret that penciler's work. And the penciler I decided to pick is John Romita Jr. I'm a big fan of John Romita Jr., especially his early Marvel work. I remember when I first saw the Man Without Fear miniseries drawn by John Romita Jr., I was really blown away because it was very much unlike a lot of the comic art that I had seen up until that point. But it grabbed my attention and I was very much intrigued by it. The older I got, and especially the more I started to actually draw and make comics, the more and more I started to appreciate it. The inker that John Romita Jr. worked with on that series was Al Williamson. And one of the reasons why I picked John Romita Jr. as the penciler for this video is because his art can be interpreted in many different ways. And if you've ever seen pictures of his pencils, they're incredibly descriptive. They're really, really well done, but so much of it is open to interpretation. I'd imagine he's one of the more challenging artists to ink on top of. He seems to use the side of the pencil quite a bit in order to block in dark shadows and masses of shapes. Every inker could interpret that line work differently. Some could decide that that's just going to be a flat, heavy black area with brush. Others can turn that into a gradation. Some can texturize it. He also works with very stark horizontals and verticals. A lot of the way he'll render clouds in a sky, for instance, might just be these very thin horizontal lines. some of his work is very much ruled out, and other lines are incredibly organic. So it would take a very skillful inker to be able to decipher between all these different lines that are put down with pencil. And I think in many ways, a lot of the inkers that worked on top of John Romita Jr.'s work afterwards were really referencing the way Al Williamson inked him. There's a really fine line between inking him and taking his art to this whole other level and completely messing it up. And I feel like Al Williamson was one of those inkers that really saw the full potential in John Romita Jr.'s artwork and was able to bring that out. So again, when we go back to this idea of an inker just being a tracer, and then you look at someone like Al Williamson inking John Romita Jr.'s work, it's very obvious to see that a good inker, a real inker, is about the furthest thing from someone who's just tracing penciled lines. In doing some of the research for this video and looking at Al Williamson and John Romita Jr. artwork, man, it's like a real treat to look at this stuff. It was a time in comics, especially in mainstream comics, where I feel like uniqueness and experimentation was really put in the forefront. There's so many ways that I feel like this art could have gone wrong, but there was someone there on the editorial side that was able to really take a chance on this stuff, and it turns out to be incredibly influential. This comic art and these stories are really what inspired so many generations of comic artists after. Another inker who worked on John Romita Jr.'s work was Scott Hanna. It seems as though he started working with John Romita Jr. when he was on Spider-Man. And at this point, John Romita Jr.'s work was a lot more developed. He had a body of work that can be referenced. And so Scott Hanna, a great inker in his own right, really brought something different to John Romita's work in a way where he wasn't necessarily copying someone like Al Williamson, for instance. It looked like he wasn't afraid to use much bolder, thicker lines to delineate between the foreground and the background. There's a cleanness to Scott Hanna's work when he's on John Romita Jr. And again, if you look at John Romita Jr.'s pencils, I wouldn't necessarily call them clean. But like I said, it takes a really good inker to be able to see through all the chaos of his mark making and to pick out the lines that he really wants you to tune into. And I feel like Scott Hanna is very, very precise in his approach to inking John Romita Jr. And it almost creates for a very lighthearted kind of aesthetic that I think works really well on something like a Spider-Man story, as opposed to a dark, grittier, much more emotional storyline like Daredevil. I think at first glance it might look as though it's a simple style, but when you really start to pay attention to what's going on in these images, like I said, there's a really fine line between making this stuff shine and completely messing it up. You have to be very confident and precise with your lines, and Scott Hanna does such a great job inking someone like John Romita Jr. I mean, the webbing on some of these pages, that alone, I could just imagine what he was working with in terms of the penciled version of that. And someone like Scott Hanna is very much a pro and is able to approach this stuff and really make it powerful. There's pages like this where I'm not sure if John Romita Jr. might have indicated that he wanted Spider-Man's costume to be blacked out and silhouetted that way, or if that was just a call by Scott Hanna, the inker. But when you're working with an inker like Scott Hanna or an Al Williamson, I wouldn't be surprised if John Romita Jr. just sort of fell back on their expertise and left that open enough so that an inker like Scott Hanna could just sort of play with it and make an interesting interpretation. And whether John Romita Jr. indicated that or not it turned out to be just an awesome Spider-Man page. So I would say when I think of John Romita Jr. and an inker, the first inker that comes to mind would be Klaus Janson. I don't know why. I guess it's because that's his most popular inker. I could be wrong. I'm sure there are other much more knowledgeable John Romita Jr. fans that might be watching this, but for whatever reason, I feel like Klaus Janson has inked the most of John Romita Jr.'s work. And Klaus Janson, of course, is an incredible artist in his own right, penciler and inker, very well known for inking Frank Miller. It's no surprise that he inks John Romita Jr. really well. Both John Romita Jr. and Frank Miller have a very similar blockiness to their style. I think both of them seem to be inspired by the other in many ways. And I feel like Klaus Janson approaches John Romita Jr.'s work somewhere in the middle between Al Williamson and Scott Hanna. He seems like he's very true to John Romita Jr.'s pencils, but he definitely inserts his own personality and varied lines and various kinds of techniques into John Romita Jr.'s work. Klaus Janson is an incredible inker. If you're someone who is learning how to ink your own work or others' work, he should definitely be on the short list of inkers that you study. I've seen other inkers ink John Romita Jr.'s more recent work, a lot of the stuff that he's done for DC in recent years. And although I am real fans of those inkers, I don't feel like the pairing really works. I think it's easy, like I said prior, to misinterpret John Romita Jr.'s pencils and perhaps turn them into something that he might not have intended. And there's a handful of inkers that I feel, for one reason or another, really understand John Romita Jr.'s intentions with his pencils. And that's one of those intangible qualities that an inker has. It's not just about being skillful with a brush or a nib and knowing all the techniques. It's being able to read the intention and the personality of a penciler and be able to differentiate between one and another. So that's my thoughts on inking on this lovely month of October, the month of inking as it has become known. I thought I would just make a video talking about inkers, what an inker might do, some of the history, and also it's probably just an excuse to look at some awesome John Romita Jr. and various inkers' artwork. So if you have any questions about inking or you have anything to add to this video, please do leave them in the comments below. I love reading the comments. Like I've mentioned in a previous video, this channel has been gaining more traction as it goes on, and one of the great things about that is that I'm getting some really great feedback in the comments and starting to understand what videos you all are enjoying, and also the recommendations that you give me in comments in terms of artists to check out, books to check out, things that I may not have known about in terms of whatever topic I'm talking about. It's pretty cool. Seems like there's a little bit of a community happening here, so that's awesome to see. So I look forward to reading your comments, hopefully on this video, and I look forward to making some more. Hopefully this is some inspiration to take you through an Inktober challenge that you might be doing. And yeah, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.